Keanu Reeves is a Hollywood icon known for his humble persona and down-to-earth nature. One incident, however, stands out, not for his fame, but for the way he handled a situation that involved a simple silver crucifix, turning it into a profound moment of personal dignity and grace. What began as a subtle act of judgment by a flight attendant over his choice of jewelry escalated into a powerful statement about respect, faith, and the freedom to be oneself. It all started at Los Angeles International Airport, LAX, one of the busiest airports in the US. People rushed through the terminals, dragging colorful suitcases, typing away on their smartphones, and frantically checking flight boards. Amid the chaos, a man walked calmly through the crowd, moving at his own pace, seemingly unaffected by the hustle around him. He wore a plain black t-shirt, worn jeans, and scuffed sneakers. Not exactly the appearance of a typical first-class passenger, but what caught the eye was the small silver crucifix hanging from his neck. It wasn't a large, flashy accessory, but there was something about it that made it stand out. This man was Keanu Reeves, though most people didn't recognize him. In fact, he passed through the terminal without drawing much attention, blending in with the crowd, looking like any other traveler. When he reached the first-class gate, he stepped into the priority line. The flight attendant, whose name was Carla, glanced at his boarding pass, then back at him, clearly unsure. She hesitated for a moment before politely telling him that he was at the wrong gate. This line was for first-class passengers. Keanu, without any sign of offense, calmly replied, "I'm at the right gate." Carla checked the boarding pass again. It was indeed valid. She recognized his name now, but his casual appearance and lack of a celebrity entourage made her hesitate. After a brief moment of internal conflict, she allowed him to proceed, but kept a watchful eye on him. Keanu settled into his first-class seat, adjusting his seatbelt. But Carla couldn't shake the discomfort she felt about the small silver crucifix hanging around his neck. It was subtle, yet it stirred something in her, something she couldn't quite explain. Her unease grew as she watched him. His calmness, his poise, everything about him seemed unremarkable on the surface. Yet there was something about that crucifix that didn't sit right with her. A short time later, Carla approached Keanu. Her tone was polite but firm, and her posture was one of professional authority. She told him that the airline had policies regarding overt religious symbols in shared spaces, and that she would appreciate it if he could conceal his crucifix. Keanu listened, his face impassive. He didn't react with anger, nor did he comply. Instead, he calmly explained, "This crucifix isn't a fashion statement. It's part of who I am." Carla, still holding her ground, smiled thinly and insisted that the company's policies were in place to ensure a neutral environment for all passengers. But Keanu's voice remained steady. "I've flown like this many times before, and no one has ever had an issue with it," he said. "This necklace has saved my life more than once, through war zones, in hospital rooms, during nights when I wasn't sure I'd wake up. It's not about provoking anyone. It's about my faith." Carla was taken aback. His words weren't loud or angry, but they resonated deeply with the passengers around him. A quiet hush fell over the cabin, and even the flight attendants noticed the shift in the air. Keanu's calm strength and unwavering respect for his own beliefs had created a moment that no one on that plane would forget. In the end, Carla had no choice but to retreat. The captain was notified, but Keanu's words had already made their mark. The moment wasn't about religion or symbols. It was about respect, dignity, and the power of staying true to oneself despite the judgment of others. This encounter between Keanu Reeves and the flight attendant is a powerful reminder of the strength that lies in quiet confidence and the courage to stand by one's beliefs. It shows that even in the most ordinary moments, there is an opportunity to make a profound statement about who we are and what we stand for. Keanu didn't need to raise his voice or escalate the situation. His actions spoke louder than words ever could. In a world that often encourages conformity, Keanu's calm defense of his right to express his faith serves as a powerful example of what it means to choose grace over conflict. His simple yet profound message is clear. We all have the right to be who we are, and we should never apologize for the things that make us who we are. Carla, the flight attendant, was accustomed to handling a variety of passengers. Over her years of experience, she had learned to read situations quickly. In her role, she often had to manage demanding customers, entitled personalities, and occasional conflicts, but nothing had quite prepared her for this moment. The encounter with Keanu Reeves, though seemingly mundane, had begun to stir something inside her that she couldn't quite name. It wasn't just about the crucifix he wore. It was about what that small symbol represented and how it challenged her preconceived notions. At first, Carla hadn't recognized Keanu. His appearance didn't match the typical first-class passenger. He wasn't wearing a suit, hadn't bothered with flashy accessories, and wasn't accompanied by an entourage. His black t-shirt, worn jeans, and scuffed sneakers made him blend in with the crowd of travelers rushing through the airport. But when she noticed the silver crucifix hanging from his neck, something about it caught her attention. Carla had always prided herself on being professional and neutral. She was trained to remain calm in all situations, to resolve conflicts with grace, and to never let personal feelings interfere with her work. Yet, in that moment, she couldn't help but feel a discomfort that she couldn't fully explain. Why was she bothered by a small piece of jewelry? It wasn't the crucifix itself. It was the presence of it, the message it carried. Carla was used to dealing with all kinds of passengers, but this one felt different. The crucifix, though small and understated, seemed to carry an energy that made her uneasy. She didn't know why, but it felt like a symbol of something larger, something more personal that challenged the neutral space she worked so hard to maintain. Her discomfort grew when Keanu approached the first-class gate and stepped into the priority line. Carla checked his boarding pass, and for a moment, she hesitated. His name was clearly printed on the ticket, but she was thrown off by his casual appearance. He wasn't the kind of person she typically saw in first class. After a quick check and confirmation that he was indeed on the right flight, she let him pass, but her eyes couldn't stop following him. As Keanu made his way down the aisle to his seat, she couldn't help but feel a strange tension building inside her. It wasn't just about his appearance. It was the way he carried himself, his quiet confidence, his calm demeanor, and the way he remained unaffected by the bustle around him seemed almost out of place in the chaotic environment of an airport. But what unsettled her most was the crucifix. As Keanu sat down and adjusted his seatbelt, the small silver cross became fully visible. It wasn't large or flashy. It wasn't a statement. Yet somehow, it seemed to carry more weight than anything she had seen that day. There was something about the symbol that challenged her sense of neutrality. In her mind, Carla began to question why she felt so uneasy. She had seen many celebrities, many people with strong personalities and flamboyant attitudes, but none had made her feel like this. Keanu wasn't demanding attention. He wasn't trying to stand out. In fact, he seemed to be the antithesis of what she had come to expect from first-class passengers. And yet, his quiet presence was unsettling to her. It wasn't just about the necklace. It was about the discomfort she felt about something she couldn't quite explain. The symbol had triggered something within her, a reaction she wasn't prepared for. She had trained herself to remain objective, to follow protocol without letting her personal biases interfere. But this situation was different. The simple crucifix seemed to hold more meaning than just a religious symbol. It represented something deeper, something Carla wasn't sure she was ready to face. As the flight began and the passengers settled into their seats, the unease Carla felt only intensified. Keanu's calmness, his quiet confidence, seemed to highlight her own discomfort. And though she didn't know it yet, the encounter was going to challenge not just her professional persona, but her own internal beliefs about respect, boundaries, and personal expression. When Carla finally approached Keanu, her heart was pounding. She wasn't sure how he would react, but she was determined to maintain control over the situation. Her voice remained polite, but firm, and her posture was that of a professional dealing with a problem. "Sir," she began, her voice soft but deliberate, "we have certain policies regarding overt religious symbolism in shared spaces. I'd like to remind you that we ask for discretion, especially in this cabin." Keanu didn't react with anger or frustration. Instead, he turned to her slowly, his expression calm and unreadable. He wasn't flustered, and there was no trace of defensiveness in his voice. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice low but steady. "Is there a rule I've broken?" Carla was taken aback. She had expected resistance, even defiance, but what she got was a simple question. Keanu wasn't confrontational. He wasn't making excuses, nor was he being apologetic. He was simply asking for clarity, as though he didn't understand why something that seemed so small could be such an issue. Carla struggled to find her next words. She had rehearsed this moment in her mind 1,000 times, but it was harder than she had anticipated. "It's not about breaking rules," she said, her voice a little sharper now. "It's about creating a neutral environment. Some passengers might find certain symbols divisive." Keanu's response was even more powerful in its simplicity. "I've flown like this many times before. No one's ever had an issue." He paused and looked down at the crucifix for a moment. "This isn't a fashion statement, and it's not a provocation. It's part of who I am." In that moment, Carla felt as though the conversation had shifted, but she couldn't put her finger on why. Keanu wasn't reacting the way she had expected. He wasn't angry, but there was a quiet strength in his words that made her realize how misplaced her discomfort had been. This wasn't about the symbol, she began to realize. This was about her own discomfort with something that she didn't fully understand or couldn't control. Carla tried to maintain her composure, but there was a vulnerability now in her posture. She wasn't just trying to uphold the policy. She was trying to justify a personal belief, one that she hadn't even fully acknowledged until this moment. As the exchange between Keanu and Carla continued, a subtle change began to take place within the cabin. The atmosphere, which had been quiet and calm before, was now charged with an invisible tension. Passengers, who had initially been unaware of the conversation, were starting to pay attention. Some glanced over from across the aisle. Others discreetly reached for their phones to capture the moment. No one said anything, but the energy in the room shifted. What had begun as a simple disagreement over a symbol was now something far deeper. It wasn't just about the crucifix. It was about the way people choose to express themselves in public, and the way that society often reacts to those expressions. Keanu's calmness in the face of Carla's challenge was a stark contrast to the usual reactions one might expect from celebrities in a similar situation. Carla could feel the eyes of the passengers on her now. They were watching, waiting to see how this situation would resolve itself. She had never been in a position like this before, and the pressure was mounting. The usual role of a flight attendant, to serve and keep the peace, felt increasingly at odds with her need to uphold the airline's policies, even when those policies no longer seemed entirely justified. As Keanu remained seated, composed and unbothered, the passengers around him started to form opinions of their own. Some were sympathetic to Keanu's position, while others were intrigued by the quiet, unspoken confrontation unfolding before them. The energy in the cabin had changed from calm to tense, but it wasn't the kind of tension that escalates into conflict. It was the kind of tension that makes people reflect on their own biases and assumptions. Carla felt trapped. She couldn't just back down now. Her professional reputation was on the line, but at the same time, she began to realize that this was no longer just about enforcing policy. It was about the respect of an individual's rights and her own ability to let go of control in order to create a more inclusive environment. As Keanu's words settled into the air, Carla began to feel an undeniable shift within herself. She had walked down the aisle confident in her role as a flight attendant, trained to uphold the policies and maintain a sense of order in the cabin. But now, she found herself questioning not only the policies she had been trained to enforce, but also her own personal beliefs and biases. In a matter of moments, the conversation had transformed into something far more profound than she had anticipated. Keanu's quiet strength had slowly stripped away the armor of professionalism she had relied on. His words, calm and firm, carried a weight that she had not expected. He wasn't shouting or demanding anything. He was simply asserting his right to wear the crucifix, a symbol that meant something deeply personal to him. His words were simple, yet they pierced through the atmosphere like a ripple in still water, forcing everyone in the cabin to take notice. In that moment, Carla realized that this situation was no longer about a piece of jewelry or a policy. It was about respecting another person's identity and the courage it took to stand firm in one's beliefs. Carla's discomfort grew as she tried to justify her position. She had always believed in upholding the rules, in maintaining neutrality, and ensuring that everyone felt comfortable in shared spaces. But now, she was forced to confront the reality that her own discomfort had clouded her judgment. Keanu's calm response wasn't just about defending his faith. It was about challenging the very notion of what it meant to respect others. It was about seeing beyond the surface, beyond the crucifix and the symbol, and recognizing the human being who stood before her. Her professional mask began to crack, and for the first time, she felt vulnerable. She had always prided herself on being able to handle any situation with poise and authority. But this was different. Keanu wasn't the typical celebrity who demanded attention or threw a tantrum when things didn't go his way. He wasn't looking to create a scene or make anyone uncomfortable. He was simply existing, unapologetically, in a way that made her question why she had ever felt uncomfortable in the first place. As the conversation continued, Carla found herself reflecting on her role in this interaction. Why had she allowed her discomfort to guide her actions? Why had she felt the need to enforce a policy that, in this moment, seemed to lack true empathy or understanding? She realized that her discomfort had nothing to do with the crucifix and everything to do with her own perceptions. She had allowed her own biases to shape her response to something that, in the grand scheme of things, was completely harmless. Keanu had done nothing wrong. He was simply being true to himself. In contrast, Carla's actions, though polite and professional on the surface, had been rooted in a fear of challenging the status quo, a fear of stepping outside the bounds of what was considered appropriate in a public setting. But the more she thought about it, the more she understood that the real issue wasn't the crucifix. It was her fear of standing up for something she believed in, her reluctance to challenge the idea that certain things, like faith and identity, should be hidden in order to maintain harmony. Keanu's response was simple but powerful. "This necklace has saved my life more than once," he had said. "It's part of who I am. I won't hide it." His words echoed in Carla's mind as she stood there, silently processing what had just transpired. She realized that Keanu wasn't just standing up for his right to wear a religious symbol. He was standing up for the right to be himself in the face of judgment. His calmness in the face of her request, his refusal to be silenced, spoke volumes about the importance of authenticity and the strength it takes to be unapologetically oneself. For the first time in her career, Carla found herself questioning the very idea of neutrality. Was it truly neutral to ask someone to hide a part of themselves in order to make others feel comfortable? Was it truly fair to enforce policies that, in certain situations, might actually silence the voices of individuals who simply wanted to express their true selves? Keanu's quiet defiance had forced her to reevaluate her role in upholding these policies. It wasn't about breaking the rules. It was about understanding the deeper implications of those rules. As the conversation came to an end, Carla knew that she had to reflect on what had just happened. She wasn't sure what the right answer was, but she knew that something had shifted in her. She had been confronted not by a rule or a policy, but by the power of a person's quiet strength, by the courage to stand firm in one's beliefs, and by the need to respect others' right to express themselves. And for the first time, Carla realized that this moment of self-reflection was more important than any rule or regulation. It was a moment that would stay with her long after the plane had landed. Eindruckskehr. This section focuses on Carla's internal conflict and self-reflection after her encounter with Keanu, exploring the personal growth and realization she experiences as she questions her own biases and the deeper implications of the policies she enforces. As the flight continued and the tension slowly began to dissipate, the impact of Keanu's quiet strength was already being felt by everyone around him. The conversation with Carla, though brief, had been a turning point, not just for her, but for everyone on board. It wasn't about the religious symbol or the airline's policy. It was about something deeper: the power of standing firm in one's beliefs, the quiet strength of owning who you are, and the humility it takes to be unapologetically yourself in the face of judgment. Carla returned to her post at the back of the plane, but her mind was still occupied by the exchange. She couldn't stop thinking about how easily she had let her discomfort influence her actions. She had tried to enforce a rule that, in the grand scheme of things, seemed trivial and unnecessary. But what struck her most was how Keanu had remained unshaken. He hadn't raised his voice, he hadn't tried to make a scene, and he certainly hadn't demanded anything of her. He had simply stood his ground with dignity and calmness, letting his words and actions speak louder than any policy or rule could. The passengers, who had been silently watching the interaction, began to stir. A few people exchanged quiet glances, their phones now out as they discreetly captured what had transpired. The subtle nature of the confrontation had turned it into something people wanted to remember. It wasn't just a story about a famous actor being asked to hide a religious symbol. It was a story about standing up for your personal beliefs, no matter the circumstances. Keanu's refusal to hide his crucifix wasn't an act of rebellion. It was an act of authenticity. It was about making a personal choice to remain true to who he was, without bowing to external pressure. He had quietly shown that sometimes the most powerful act of resistance is simply to remain calm and steadfast in your own truth. His example was a reminder that we all have the right to express ourselves, regardless of the space we occupy, and that those expressions deserve respect, not judgment. What made Keanu's stance even more powerful was the lack of drama. He didn't make a spectacle of the situation. He didn't try to provoke the passengers or make Carla feel bad for her request. Instead, he took a deep breath, calmly stated his position, and let the situation unfold. By doing so, he transformed the atmosphere of the entire flight. The cabin, which had once felt like a neutral space, was now charged with a quiet energy, a collective reflection on respect, personal boundaries, and the courage to stand up for what you believe in. The change was subtle, but significant. As the flight continued, the passengers, who had been strangers only hours before, began to reflect on their own beliefs and actions. For some, the confrontation with Keanu served as a moment of personal growth. It forced them to question their own responses to others' expressions of faith and identity. For others, it was a reminder that sometimes the most important thing you can do is listen and respect someone's right to be themselves, even if you don't fully understand or agree with their beliefs. Carla, too, had changed. She wasn't sure how she would handle situations like this in the future, but she knew that this moment had taught her something valuable. It wasn't just about following the rules or maintaining authority. It was about listening to people, understanding their needs, and, most importantly, respecting their right to exist as they are. As she made her way back down the aisle later in the flight, she found herself reflecting on the power of silence and the impact of a simple gesture of defiance. Keanu's calm strength had quietly altered the course of the flight, and the effect it had on Carla and the passengers was undeniable. The encounter was a reminder that sometimes the smallest moments can lead to the most profound changes. It wasn't about a policy being broken or an argument won. It was about the human connection that happens when we choose to stand by our values, quietly and without apology. As the plane touched down and the passengers disembarked, the story of the quiet confrontation would linger in the minds of those who had witnessed it. Keanu Reeves hadn't just defended a piece of jewelry, he had defended his right to be himself, and in doing so, had sparked a shift in how others viewed the world around them. For Carla, it was a lesson in humility, respect, and the power of quiet resilience. A lesson she would carry with her long after the flight had ended. As the airplane cruised smoothly through the sky, the quiet tension from earlier still hung in the air, but it was now intertwined with something far deeper, something intangible that everyone in the cabin had felt. Keanu's calm, dignified response to the flight attendant's request had transformed what was initially a routine, mundane flight into an opportunity for personal reflection for everyone on board. The lesson he had unknowingly imparted that day wasn't about religious symbols, policy enforcement, or even the mere presence of a crucifix. It was about grace over conflict, about how standing firm in one's beliefs can be far more powerful than any confrontation, no matter how subtle. In a world where social media thrives on loud voices, hot takes, and quick judgments, Keanu's quiet refusal to comply with an arbitrary rule was a reminder of the quiet power that grace and patience can have in moments of tension. His approach was almost revolutionary in its simplicity. He didn't yell, didn't argue, and didn't escalate the situation in any way. He merely stood his ground, communicated his truth with respect, and let his actions speak for themselves. By doing so, he not only asserted his personal beliefs, but also forced others in the cabin, including Carla, to confront their own biases and assumptions. The passengers in the cabin, many of whom had been passive observers just moments before, were now deeply engaged in the unfolding drama. Not because of the potential for conflict, but because of the lessons being shared without a single raised voice. They saw how Keanu refused to be swayed by a policy that didn't seem to account for individual freedoms. In a moment where others might have been quick to dismiss or argue, Keanu chose the high road, an act of resistance not rooted in anger, but in unwavering self-respect and quiet defiance. For many passengers, this moment would remain etched in their memories long after the flight had ended. It wasn't just the story of a celebrity standing up for his beliefs. It was the story of anyone who has ever faced judgment or discomfort for simply existing as their authentic selves. Keanu's stance spoke to the importance of standing firm in the face of adversity, not with aggression or force, but with a calm and unshakable certainty in who you are. The lesson was simple. Sometimes the most powerful form of resistance is to remain true to yourself, quietly and without apology. Carla, who had been at the center of the confrontation, would likely never forget the moment either. Though she hadn't expected the situation to challenge her so profoundly, it did. In trying to enforce what she thought was the right way to behave in a shared public space, she had unintentionally reinforced her own biases and assumptions. It wasn't about the crucifix, nor was it about enforcing policy. It was about respecting another person's right to be who they were, without judgment or interference. Keanu's refusal to comply with her request wasn't just a personal stance. It was a challenge to the very idea that people should hide parts of themselves to avoid making others uncomfortable. It made her question whether her role as a flight attendant was about following orders or about promoting respect and understanding. As the flight came to an end, there was an undeniable shift in the air. The passengers, now more introspective, began to understand that Keanu's action, though simple, was anything but insignificant. It was a moment of profound human connection, a reminder that we all have the right to express ourselves, to stand up for what we believe in, and to do so in a way that is grounded in grace, not conflict. Keanu's quiet strength had set an example that resonated with everyone, reminding them that true power lies not in domination or control, but in the ability to hold fast to your convictions with dignity and humility. When the plane landed and the passengers disembarked, the story of the encounter with Keanu Reeves wasn't something that was quickly forgotten. The quiet defiance, the choice to stand tall without raising a voice, had left its mark on everyone who had witnessed it. Keanu had taught them all a lesson that would carry far beyond the cabin of that airplane. In a world where people often feel the need to shout to be heard, his example showed that sometimes silence, confidence, and grace can make the most profound impact. The story of the flight attendant, the crucifix, and the man who chose grace over conflict would go on to inspire those who heard it. A reminder that the true measure of a person isn't in how loud they speak, but in how firmly they stand by their values, quietly and without apology.